My name is Victor Montalgo, and I am the last man who remembers what the habitat looked like before they came. I am old now. The hand I used to write this shakes when I have not slept, which is most nights. The people who run this colony think I am a quiet old fool who spent too many years in vacuum and lost some pressure between the ears. Let them think it. I will tell this the way it happened, in the order it happened, and if anyone reads it after I am gone, they can decide for themselves whether I lost my mind or whether I saw something the rest of the species was not yet ready to look at. I worked maintenance on Halcyon Ring, third habitat in the orbit of a colony world called Murado that everyone had quietly given up on. Murado had been a green dream once. The brochures my grandfather kept showed wheat fields under a violet sky. By the time I was born, the soil had turned on us. Some kind of fungal bloom in the regolith that no agronomist could shake. The settlers came back up the cable in shifts, and the habitats around Murado filled with farmers who would never farm again and miners who had nothing left to mine. Halcyon Ring was the largest of those habitats. 40,000 souls when I started my apprenticeship. 28,000 by the time of what I am about to describe. People left. Nobody came. I lived in a 6-meter unit on the inner ring B tier, near a recycler that hummed at a frequency you stopped hearing after the first year. I had a wife once. Her name was Inez, and she died when I was 36 of an embolism that no clinic on the ring could catch in time. We had no children. I had a dog, a wire-haired mongrel named Bruto that the previous tenant had left behind, and I had my tools, and I had a quiet route through the maintenance shafts that I could walk in my sleep. That was my life. I was 51 years old. I had made my peace with finishing it the way I had lived it. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday. I remember the day because Tuesdays I drew filter rotation in the long corridor between H block and the food court, and I was halfway through the third filter when the lights browned out. Not a flicker. A long, slow brown, like somebody on the bridge had laid a hand on the master rheostat and leaned. The corridor went the color of weak tea for maybe 14 seconds. Then it came back. I stood there with the dirty filter in my gloves and waited for the comm to chirp with an explanation. None came. I finished the rotation. I walked back to my unit. Bruto met me at the hatch with his tail going and his eyes wrong. He was looking past my hip, into the corner where the recycler hummed, and his ears were flat against his skull. I have lived with dogs my whole life. I know the difference between a dog that has heard a rat and a dog that has seen a thing it does not have a name for. Bruto had seen a thing he did not have a name for. There was nothing in the corner. I checked anyway. I checked under the bunk behind the wash unit in the storage locker. I checked the access panel to the recycler vent and found it sealed and undisturbed. I made tea because that is what I did when I did not know what else to do, and I sat on the bunk with Bruto pressed against my legs shaking, and I drank the tea, and I waited for the wrongness to leave the room. It did not leave. It just got quieter. That night I dreamed of 2 figures standing at the foot of my bunk. They were not tall. They were not short. They were the shape of men only in the way a coat thrown over a chair is the shape of a man, outline without anatomy. One of them was holding something long and thin that might have been a clipboard if clipboards were made of bone. The other was eating an apple. I have not eaten an apple since I was a boy on Murado, before the soil went bad. The smell of it in my dream was so vivid that I woke up weeping, and the smell stayed in the unit for 3 days. The second sign was the Henderson boy. The Hendersons lived 4 units down from me. The boy was 9, maybe 10. A serious kid with a stammer and a habit of asking me questions about gear ratios when I came past. His mother found him in the corridor on a Thursday morning standing perfectly still, looking up at the ceiling, smiling. He did not respond when she said his name. She had to carry him back to their unit. When the clinic finally got him to speak, he said the same sentence over and over for 2 days. He said, "The men say I am the wrong size for the game. The men say I am the wrong size for the game. The men say I am the wrong size for the game." Then he stopped speaking entirely and never started again. Ring took notice. There was a town meeting in the food court. A doctor stood up and used the word psychosis, and a councilwoman stood up and used the word stress, and a man I did not know stood up and said his wife had seen two figures at the end of her corridor and they had tipped their hats to her. The hats. That detail. He said his wife had described hats and she had never in her life seen a hat outside of an archive. The councilwoman thanked him and told him to take his wife to the clinic. The meeting ended without a decision being made. I went home. I sat with Bruto. I cleaned my tools because that is what I did when I did not know what else to do, and then there was a knock on my hatch. You have to understand, nobody knocks on halcyon ring. The hatches have chimes. The chimes are wired to the corridor sensors and they trigger before a person has finished raising their hand. A knock is an archaic sound. A knock is a sound from before. I had not heard a knock in 20 years, and when I heard it that night I knew, in the part of myself that does not need to think a thing through to know it, that what was on the other side of the hatch was not from halcyon ring, and was not from Murado, and was not, in any sense that mattered, from anywhere I had a map for. I opened the hatch anyway. I am not brave. I want that on the record. I opened the hatch because I have spent my life opening hatches, and the muscle of opening hatches was older than the fear. There were two of them. They were the shape of men. They wore long coats the color of dried blood, and they wore hats, wide-brimmed hats of a kind I had only seen in the archive footage of pre-colonial Earth. Their faces were not faces. I want to be careful here because the easy thing to say is that they had no faces, and that is not true. They had faces. The faces had features. The features did not stay in the same arrangement when you looked away and looked back. The eyes were in different places. The mouth had moved. You could not hold the face in your memory for longer than the instant you were looking at it. And the instant you looked away it was gone. And what was left in your head was a coat and a hat, and the certainty that there had been a face there, somewhere, doing something you had not been invited to understand. The taller one tipped his hat. He said, "Good evening, Mr. Montalgo. We are the Exterminators." I have replayed that moment 10,000 times. I have tried to remember what his voice sounded like, and I cannot. It was not high or low. It was not friendly or threatening. It was the voice you hear when someone reads the safety regulations over the comm on the first day of an orbital tour. It was the voice of a thing that had no stake in being heard. The shorter one held up what I had thought was a clipboard. It was not a clipboard. It was a flat piece of something that I am going to call bone because no other word fits. There were marks on it that moved when I tried to read them. He said, "We are here regarding the infestation." He said it the way a man says he is here regarding the leak in the upstairs unit. I asked what infestation. The taller one tipped his hat again. He said, "You." I'm going to skip ahead now, because if I write down everything they said to me in that doorway I will lose my nerve, and the rest of this needs to be written. I will say only that they did not come in. They stood in the corridor and they explained, in the patient tone of men explaining a matter of routine, that the species occupying this region of the cluster had been flagged for removal, that the paperwork was in order, that the contract had been signed at a level I would not understand and could not appeal. That I personally was not the target of the action, that I was simply a unit in the affected volume, and that the removal would be carried out according to procedures that had been refined over a great many similar contracts in a great many similar volumes, and that I should not be alarmed because alarm did not affect the outcome, and the procedures were humane by the standards of the office that employed them. Then the shorter one said something I have not been able to forget. He said, "Also, we like to make it interesting. We like a game." The taller one tipped his hat a third time and they walked away down the corridor. I closed the hatch. I sat on the floor of my unit with my back against the bulkhead and Bruto in my lap, and I did not move for 6 hours. In the morning, the comm chirped. It was the council. 84 people on the ring had not woken up. Their hearts had stopped between 2 and 4 in the local night. The medical staff could find no cause. They had simply stopped. The ring was a single grieving community by lunch and a single panicking community by dinner. And by the second night, nobody was sleeping alone. And by the third night, the council had declared a state of emergency. And by the fourth night, the second wave came, and another 212 people were gone. I knew what was happening, and I did not say. I want to confess that here. I sat in my unit with Bruto, and I told no one. I told no one because I had been told in that patient voice that alarm did not affect the outcome, and I had believed it, and I was ashamed of believing it, and the shame kept me silent. I wanted on the record that I was a coward in the first week. I will not pretend otherwise. The men who tell this kind of story always pretend they were brave from the start, and they are lying, and I am not going to lie. The first man I told was a maintenance foreman named Alu Akinwand. Alu had been my friend for 22 years. He was a big man, soft-spoken, with hands the size of dinner plates, and a way of looking at a damaged panel, and knowing exactly where the fault was before he had run a single diagnostic. He came to my unit on the 5th night because his sister was one of the dead, and he could not be alone. I poured him a glass of the spirit I had been saving for my own funeral, and I told him about the knock and the hats and the bone clipboard and the patient voice. I told him about the game. Alu did not call me crazy. That is what I want to remember about Alu at the start of this before everything that came after. He did not call me crazy. He listened. He drank the spirit. He set the glass down on my knee table and he looked at me with his big tired eyes and he said, "Well, Victor, if they want to play a game, we should figure out the rules." I do not know if I have ever loved a man more than I loved Alu in that moment. Started small. We started with what we knew. The hearts had stopped at night. The people who stopped were not all in the same block, not all the same age, not all the same anything that the council had been able to find a pattern in. We sat in my unit for 2 days with paper and pencils, which Alu had requisitioned from the archive on a pretext, and we made columns and lists, and we cross-referenced, and we argued, and we drank tea, and we slept in shifts, and Bruto watched us with his ears flat. The pattern Alu found on the second morning was that every person who had died had, in the week before, lost something: a glove, a wedding band, a photograph, a favorite mug, some small object that they had reported missing or quietly mourned. The shorter one with the bone clipboard had been taking trophies. Each of the dead had been marked. I almost told Alu to stop, almost said, "Leave it alone, we are not equipped for this." But Alu had already moved on. Alu was a man who, once he had a fault diagnosed, began to think about the repair. He said, "All right. If they are taking trophies before the kill, then a person who knows they have lost something can be on watch. We can warn people. We can give them a chance." We could not tell the council. The council would have arrested us or sedated us or both. So we told the people we trusted. Alu told his crew. I told the 3 families on my corridor that I knew well enough to risk. Within a week there were 40 people on the ring who knew, and within 2 weeks there were 200, and the network spread the way these things spread when the official channels have failed and people are dying in the dark. A man told his wife. A wife told her mother. A mother told the woman she played cards with on Sundays. By the end of the 3rd week, half the ring knew that if you lost a small thing you should not sleep alone, and the rate of deaths had dropped, not to 0, but enough that the council noticed and could not explain it. The exterminators noticed too. The second visit was to Alu, not to me. They came to his unit on a Thursday night. He told me about it the next morning over breakfast in the food court, his big hands wrapped around a mug, his eyes the color of old smoke. He said the taller one had tipped his hat and said, "Good evening, Mr. Akinwand. We understand you have been studying the procedures. We appreciate engagement. It improves the quality of the game." Then the shorter one had held up the bone clipboard and made a mark on it, and they had left. Alu set the mug down. He said, "Victor, we have their attention now." He said it the way a man says he has put his hand into a piece of machinery he has been told not to put his hand into. I will not pretend the next part was clever. There was no clever. There were 2 of us and there were 40,000 on the ring, half of them now aware that something was hunting them and the other half catching it like a flu, And there were two entities in coats and hats who could walk through any hatch on the habitat and stop any heart they chose. And the rules of the game were rules they had made and could change without telling us. There was no clever. There was only stubborn, and stubborn is a thing my species is built for, and stubborn is what we did. We started leaving things out for them. This was Alu's idea, and I want to give him the credit because by the end of this story, Alu is going to be dead and the credit is all he has left. Alu said they like trophies, they like to take, so let us give them things to take. Let us flood the volume with little objects, marked and unmarked, sincere and decoy. Let us make the game so noisy they cannot tell what is a real loss and what is bait. We told the network. The network told the ring. Within a month, every corridor on Halcyon was strung with small objects on cords, buttons, beads, finger rings, photographs, milk teeth, single earrings, the small mournable things of a habitat full of grieving people. We tied them to doorways. We tied them to the railings of the inner ring. We tied them to the recycler vents and to the chairs in the food court and to the legs of the cots in the clinic. We made the ring look like a haunted festival. We made it so that any one of those objects might be a trophy, and none of them was a guarantee. The death slowed. They did not stop, but they slowed. The third visit was to a woman named Dr. Eva Pyerly. Dr. Pyerly was the senior physician at the clinic, and she had begun to suspect on her own that the deaths were not natural. She had been running quiet tests. She had been taking blood. She had been finding in the blood of the dead microscopic structures that she could not identify and that her instruments could not properly resolve. She had not gone to the council. She had come to Alu, who was her cousin's husband, and Alu had brought her to me, and we had told her everything. Dr. Pyerly was a small woman with a steel-gray bun and a voice that could strip insulation. She listened to our story. She did not flinch. When we were done, she said, "Gentlemen, what you are describing is not biology. What you are describing is metaphysics with a uniform on. But the bodies in my morgue are real and I have a job to do, so I will work with you. And if we are wrong, we will all look like fools. And if we are right, we will all be dead. And either way, I would rather be doing something than nothing." She came home one night to find them in her kitchen. The taller one was sitting on her counter with his hat in his lap. The shorter one was eating an apple. She told us about it the next morning in the food court, her hand steady around her tea, her face a color I have not seen before or since. She said the taller one had told her, "Good evening, Dr. Pyerly. We have been admiring your investigations." He said, "We like a worthy opponent. We have decided to grant you a question. One question. We will answer truthfully. We do not lie. We find lying uninteresting." Dr. Pyerly was the kind of woman who does not waste a question. She had been thinking about what to ask them from the moment she had walked into her kitchen and seen them there. She did not ask why. She did not ask who they worked for. She did not ask how to stop them. She asked, "What is the largest object you have removed?" The shorter one stopped eating his apple. The taller one tipped his hat. He said a moon. He said, "We removed a moon once." He did not elaborate. They left. She told us this at breakfast, and we did not speak for a long time. Alu broke first. He said, "That was a strange question to ask." Dr. Pyerly set her cup down. She said, "Alu, I was not asking for information. I was asking to find out if they could be embarrassed." She said, "They answered me. They answered me precisely. They are bureaucrats. They keep records. They have a sense of professional pride." She said they can be embarrassed. That was the day the game changed. That was the day we started to win, although it would be more than a year before any of us understood that, and many of us would be dead before the understanding arrived. We had been playing defense. We had been hiding our trophies in noise. We had been keeping each other awake. We had been pooling what little we knew. Dr. Pyerly's insight pushed us onto something that resembled offense. If they were bureaucrats, if they kept records, if they had standards, if they had professional pride, then they could be made to look bad in front of whoever audited them. We did not know who audited them. We assumed someone did, because everything audits something, even, apparently, the offices that schedule the removal of species from the cluster. We started cheating. This is the part of the story I am most proud of, and the part I am most ashamed of, and the part that the priests on this colony would tell you not to be proud of at all. We cheated. We broke every rule we could find. They had told me on that first night that the procedures were humane by the standards of the office that employed them. We made the procedures inhumane. We dragged the bodies of the dead into the corridors, and we propped them in chairs in the food court, and we put cards in their hands, and we set tea in front of them as if they were still alive. We refused to mourn correctly. We refused to bury our dead on the schedule the habitat regulations required. We stacked them in the freezer of the food court, and we labeled them and we kept them. We made the ring uninhabitable not just to the exterminators but to ourselves, and we did it on purpose, because if the game required a sane and orderly population, then we would make ourselves an insane and disorderly one, and let them try to do their accountancy in a charnel house. The shorter one came to me about it, only him. The taller one was not with him. He stood in my hatch and he did not tip a hat because his hat was already off, held against his side, and his face moved in that way I could not hold in my memory. He said, "Mr. Montalgo, the bodies." He said it the way a man says, "Sir, there is something in your yard that you might want to deal with." I said, "What about the bodies?" He said, "The bodies are interfering with the procedures." He said, "The procedures are designed to operate on a population that maintains its dead." He said, "You are not maintaining your dead." I said, "That is correct." He said, "We are going to have to file an exception." He said it with a small, peevish note in his voice, the closest thing to emotion I had heard from either of them, and it was the note of a man whose paperwork has been complicated by a customer who did not follow the instructions on the form. I said, "File your exception." He stood there a moment longer. Then he put his hat back on and he walked away, and that night nobody on the ring died. Not one. The first night in 11 months. We celebrated by leaving the bodies where they were. We celebrated by tying more trophies to the railings. We celebrated by telling the network they can be inconvenienced. They have a process. The process has limits. Find the limits. Break them. Within a week we had 2 more limits found. Alu's people on the maintenance crew discovered that the exterminators could not pass through a hatch that had been welded shut. They could not phase through metal. They could walk through any hatch that opened, and they could appear in any room you were in, but if you welded yourself into a unit, they had to stand outside and call to you, like men at a door that the owner was refusing to answer. This was small. This was not a victory. But it was a wall, and walls are the beginning of every defense ever mounted by my species, and we mounted ours quickly. The corridors of Halcyon Ring filled with welded hatches. Whole blocks sealed themselves off. The infrastructure groaned. Maintenance, my own profession, became a religious vocation overnight. We could not seal every room because we still had to live, and living required air and water and food and the moving of people through the volume. But we sealed what we could, and we built airlocks where we needed to move between sealed zones, and we adapted, the way you adapt when the alternative is dying. The second limit was Dr. Pyerly's. She discovered, by carefully examining the records of who had died and when and where, that the exterminators had been working their way along a schedule, a geographic schedule. The deaths had moved through the ring in a slow, methodical rotation, sector by sector, week by week. They were not arbitrary. They were a route. And a route, she pointed out to us in the back of the clinic at 3 in the morning, can be disrupted. A route can be jammed. A route can be made to take longer than the budget allows. She said, "Gentlemen, I do not know what their budget is, but everything in the universe runs on a budget. Even gods, if they are gods, have superiors. Slow them down enough and someone will ask why." We slowed them down. This was the year of small sabotages. This was the year of nothing quite working. We jammed the ventilation in the sectors they were due to visit, so that the corridors filled with maintenance crews wearing breath masks, and the exterminators had to wait in the queue. We shut down the lights in their target zones, so that they had to do their work in dark we had refused to illuminate. We staged drunken festivals in the corridors they were trying to walk through, 300 people deep, with drums and singing and the worst dancing my species is capable of, which is considerable. We blocked their access. We did not stop them. We could not stop them. But we delayed them, and we delayed them, and we delayed them, and the death slowed from a torrent to a stream to a trickle. And by the second year of the haunting, the rate of removal had dropped by 90%, and the population of Halcyon Ring had stabilized for the first time since I had been a boy. I want to tell you what those festivals were like, because they were the strangest thing my species ever did on that habitat, and they were also the truest. We had been a quiet people on Halcyon Ring before the exterminators came. We were the leftovers of a failed colony, and we had carried the failure with us up the cable, and we had kept it close, and we had not made noise. There was a kind of shame in surviving a place that had killed your grandfather's dream. You walked the corridors quietly. You ate quietly. You drank quietly. You died quietly. The ring had been a quiet place for as long as I had been alive, and the quiet had been a kind of mourning we had not known we were doing. The festivals broke the quiet. The first one was in F Block, on the anniversary of the second wave, which we had started to mark on a calendar Alu had drawn on the wall of my unit in pencil. We had heard, through the network, that the exterminators were scheduled to sweep F Block that night. Dr. Pyerly had figured the schedule from the death records. We did not know if she was right. We hoped she was right. Alu took his crew into F Block at dusk, and they pulled the lights, every fixture, every emergency strip, and they wired up a string of construction lamps in the long corridor between the food court and the hydroponics bay, and they ran the lamps on a generator they had built themselves out of recycler parts, and they tuned the generator to throb, to pulse the lights in the corridor like a slow heart. Then they wheeled out the drums. I do not know where the drums came from. I have asked over the years and nobody will tell me. Somebody on Halcyon Ring had been keeping drums hidden in a storage locker for 40 years, against the day they would be needed, and that day had come, and the drums had come out and they were beautiful. They were heavy. They were the kind of drums you can feel in your chest from across a habitat. Alu's crew set them up at the four corners of the long corridor and they began to play, and the rest of F Block came out of their units, because what else were they going to do, and they began to dance. And then the rest of E Block came over because they could hear it through the bulkheads, and then half of D Block. And by midnight there were 2,000 people in that corridor under the throbbing lights with the drums going, and we were not dancing the way you dance at a wedding. And we were not dancing the way you dance at a celebration. We were dancing the way you dance at a funeral when the funeral has gone on too long, and the grief has turned, finally, into something else. We were dancing the way you dance when you have nothing left to lose, and you have decided to spend it loudly. The exterminators came at 3 in the morning. The network had a watcher posted at the F Block hatch, and the watcher saw them and the watcher rang the bell, an old maritime bell that Alu had requisitioned from the archive, and the drums went faster, and the dance went tighter, and when the two figures in coats and hats stepped into the corridor they had to push through us, physically push through us, with their long coats brushing our shoulders, and we did not stop dancing, and we did not stop drumming, and we did not look at them. Because Dr. Pyerly had said in her instructions that the procedure required the subject's attention and we were going to refuse to give it. We were going to be a corridor full of backs. We were going to be a corridor full of drums and pulsing light and bodies in motion, and they were going to walk through it like two clerks who had wandered into the wrong building, and that is what they did. They walked the length of the corridor. They reached the end. They turned. They walked back. They did not stop. They did not speak. They did not tip their hats. When they reached the hatch they had come in through, they paused, and the taller one looked back, and I want to swear, I cannot prove it, but I want to swear, that for 1 second the throbbing light caught his face in such a way that the face stayed still. The face stayed still. For 1 second I saw it clearly, and what I saw on it was confusion. Pure, simple, bureaucratic confusion. The look of a man who has come to do a job, and found that the building has rearranged itself in the night. Then they left. Nobody died in F Block that night. There were 41 festivals over the next 18 months. I attended most of them. I cannot dance. I have never been able to dance. I went anyway. I went and I stood at the back and I drummed when they handed me a drum, and I shouted when they shouted, and I clapped when they clapped. And the first time the exterminators walked past me in a festival corridor, I did not look at them. And the second time I did not look at them. And the third time I did look at them, by accident, just for an instant, and the shorter one looked back, and he made a mark on his bone clipboard, and I felt my heart hesitate in my chest for 2 beats. And then it started again, and I have wondered ever since whether he had decided in that instant to take me and then changed his mind, or whether he had decided not to take me and then changed his mind back, and whether I am alive today because of a decision a clerk in a coat and a hat made in the time it takes to take a breath. I do not know. I will never know. I drummed harder after that. I drummed until my hands were raw. I drummed until Alu took the drum away from me and put his big hand on my shoulder and said, "Victor, you have done enough. Sit down." And I sat down on the floor of the corridor and I wept. And nobody saw me weep because everybody was dancing. And that is one of the small mercies of a festival. Alu died on the 63rd day of the 2nd year. I want to tell this carefully, because Alu has not had his death told properly in any account, and the council's record of his death is wrong, and the version that goes around the ring at parties is wrong, and I am the only person left who knows what happened, and I am going to put it down here. Alu and I had been working in the maintenance shafts under B tier that night. There had been a coolant leak. It was a real leak, nothing to do with the exterminators, just a pipe that had been losing pressure for 15 years and had finally given up. We had been down there for 6 hours. We were tired. Alu had stopped to drink water from his canteen, and he had set the canteen on a strut, and he had walked over to me to look at the joint I was working on. And when he walked back, the canteen was gone. I am going to say that again because I want it on the page exactly the way it happened. The canteen was gone. We had been alone in the shaft. The shaft had one entrance which we had welded behind us because by then we welded everything behind us. There was no rat. There was no draft. The canteen had been on the strut in our line of sight, and Alu had walked 10 meters and turned around, and the canteen was not there. Alu looked at me. I looked at Alu. He said, "Victor," he said, "I think they have taken my trophy." He said it the way a man says, "I think I have left the iron on." I said, "The canteen." He said, "The canteen." He said, "My father gave me that canteen." He said, "It was his father's." He said, "It is the oldest thing I own." I said, "Alu," I said, "we welded the hatch." He said, "Victor." He said, "The hatch did not stop them." He said, "Only the killing has rules." He said, "The watching has no rules." He said, "They have been watching me the whole time." I did not know what to say. I am not and have never been a man with words at the ready. I stood there in the coolant fog with my torch in my hand, and I tried to think of something to say to my friend who had just told me he was going to die, and I could not think of anything, and Alu, who was always the better man between us, smiled at me. He smiled. He had a wide smile, Alu, with one chipped tooth at the front. He said, "Victor, do not look like that." He said, "We knew this was the game." He said, "I have been on a clock since the first night." He said, "Every one of us has been on a clock since the first night." He said, "The only question was whose number came up." He said, "My number came up." He said, "Finish the joint, please, because if we leave it, the whole sector is going to be cold by morning and the bobbies in D block will freeze, and I do not want my last shift to have been a shift that froze a baby." We finished the joint. He held the torch for me. His hands were steady. When we came up out of the shaft, he hugged me. He had never hugged me before. He was a private man with his body, Alu, in the way many big men are. He hugged me, and then he said, "Victor, do me one favor," and I said, "Anything," and he said, "Do not let me die alone." He said, "Sit with me tonight." He said, "I do not want to die alone." I sat with him. We went to his unit. His wife had died 3 years before of the same fungal cough that had killed 20,000 on the surface. He had 2 grown children who had emigrated to a different cluster on the last transport. He had been alone in that unit for a long time. We sat at his table. We drank the rest of the spirit I had been saving for my funeral, which by then was almost gone. We talked about Murado. He told me a story about his father, about a fishing trip on the surface back when the surface still had water in it, about a fish his father had caught that had been so large the 2 of them could not lift it together, and they had to drag it home through the mud, leaving a trench in the mud, and his mother had stood in the doorway of their farmhouse and laughed at them. He laughed when he told the story. He laughed the whole way through. I had heard the story before, 3 or 4 times, and I laughed at the right places because that is what you do when a friend is telling you, again, the story he loves most. He died at 4 in the morning. He had been talking and then he was not talking, and his head was on his arm on the table and his big hand was open on the wood with the palm up, and the spirit in his glass was untouched. I sat with him for an hour before I called Dr. Pyerly. I sat with my hand on his back. I did not weep. I would weep later. At that moment I was beyond weeping. I was somewhere quieter than weeping, in a place where you sit with a friend who has just left and you keep him company for a little longer, because that is the last thing you can do for him, and it costs you nothing and it is everything. Dr. Pyerly came at 5. She examined him. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Victor," she said, "I am so sorry." She said, "We did not know they could take a canteen through a welded hatch." She said, "We know now." She said, "Write it down." I wrote it down. I added a line to the network's growing list of rules. Rule 47, they do not need open hatches to observe. The weld stops the kill. It does not stop the watch. We sent the rule out at 6 in the morning before the food court opened, and by lunch every welded unit on Halcyon Ring had been re-examined and the small treasured objects had been moved to new hiding places, and the people who lived in those units had begun, in the way my species begins these things, to grieve a friend they had never met. Alu had been famous on the network. The network had been, in some sense, his. He had built it. He had held it together. He was the one who had said, "If they want to play a game, we should figure out the rules." He had been, without ever using the word, our captain. We buried him in the food court freezer with the others, and we did not bury them, any of them, for another 16 months, until the deal with the taller one came, and when we buried Alu, we buried him with a canteen that was not his. The taller one had not returned the original. The shorter one had it, somewhere, in whatever office they came from, on whatever shelf they kept their trophies on. And I have thought about that canteen on dark nights, and I have hoped, in a way that is not Christian and not kind, that it gives them no joy, that it sits on their shelf as a reminder that the price of taking it was the contract they could not complete. That every time they look at it, they remember the corridor of drums and the dancing backs, and the small old man at the back who could not dance and would not look at them. Dr. Pyerly kept working. She had to. We all had to. The grief for Alu was a thing we carried while we did everything else, the way you carry a heavy tool while you are working on something else, the way the weight of it becomes part of how you move. She worked harder after he died. She worked with a focus that frightened the rest of us. She did not sleep in her unit anymore. She slept on a cot in her office at the clinic, when she slept at all, and she ran her tests on the structures in the blood of the dead. And she compared the structures to the schedule she had mapped, and she found, over those long months, a pattern that the rest of us could not have seen because we did not have her instruments and her training and her steel gray bun. She found that the structures in the blood of the dead were not random. The structures changed over time. The structures in the blood of the 84 who had died on the first night were a specific shape. The structures in the blood of the 212 who had died on the second wave were a slightly different shape. The structures in the blood of the dead from each successive sweep were a fractionally different shape, the way the handwriting of a clerk changes over a long shift as the wrist grows tired. The structures were a signature. The structures were a kind of stamp. And the stamp, she told us in her office one night, was being applied with diminishing precision. The stamp was getting sloppier. The exterminators were getting tired. She said this with her steel-gray bun coming loose, with her eyes red, with her small hands flat on the table between us. She said, "Gentlemen," she said, "they are not infinite." She said, "Whatever they are, they fatigue." She said, "We have made them tired." She said, "A tired clerk makes mistakes, and a tired clerk eventually asks his supervisor if he can be reassigned." That was the night I went home and slept for the first time in a year. That was the night I lay down on my bunk with Bruto on my feet, who was old by then, who could barely lift his head, and I closed my eyes and I let myself believe, just for the few hours before the next shift, that we were going to live. We jammed them harder after that. We jammed them with everything we had. The festivals became weekly. The corridors stayed dark. The welded units multiplied. We staged what Alu, if he had been there, would have called the world's slowest riot, a constant low-grade refusal of the habitat to function in the way an exterminator would have expected a habitat to function. The food court served dinner at breakfast time and breakfast at midnight. The shifts ran on no schedule anyone could predict. The lights in C-tier ran on the wrong frequency for 2 solid months, because the maintenance crew had decided that flicker was the new normal and any exterminator who came through C-tier was going to have to do their accountancy in a strobe. We made ourselves uncountable. We made ourselves unschedulable. We made ourselves, in the precise bureaucratic sense, a nightmare. The taller one came to me about it. Only him. The shorter one was not with him. He stood in my hatch and he tipped his hat the way he had on the first night and he said, "Mr. Montalgo, we need to talk." I let him in. This is the only time either of them came inside my unit. Bruto, who had grown old, who had grown so old that he could no longer rise from his blanket when I came home, looked up at the figure in my doorway and growled, and then sighed, and then closed his eyes. The figure walked past him without looking down. He sat at my knee table. He set his hat on the table. The face did the thing the face did. I poured him a cup of tea because I did not know what else to do. He did not drink it. He said, "Mr. Montalgo, the procedures are not progressing." I said, "No, they are not." He said, "We have been at this site for 2 years and 7 months. The contract specified 6 months. I said, "I am sorry to hear that." He said, "Are you?" He said it without inflection, the way he said everything, and I could not tell if it was a question. I said, "I am sorry that you are inconvenienced. I am not sorry that we are alive." He sat with that for a long time. Then he said, "Mr. Montalgo, the contract is going to be reviewed by our superiors. They will ask why a routine removal has taken 5 times the projected duration. They will ask whether the failure is procedural or whether it is a failure of the population." He said, "This is bad for our office." He said, "This is bad for me personally." I said, "That is interesting." He said, "Yes." He said, "I thought you might find it interesting." We sat with that for a while. He picked up his hat. He set it on his head. He said, "Mr. Montalgo, I have been authorized to make an offer." He said, "The office is prepared to file the volume as non-productive and withdraw." He said, "This is a face-saving measure. The contract will not be marked completed. It will be marked unviable. The species in this volume will be flagged as not worth the labor cost of removal." He said, "Your species will not be exterminated." He said, "Your species will, however, be flagged." I said, "What does flagged mean?" He said, "It means you are an embarrassment. It means our office will not return. It means also that other offices will see the flag and will hesitate. We are not the only office. There are many offices. The flag will protect you for a time against many of them. It will not protect you forever. Nothing protects anything forever." He said, "But it will protect you for a time." I said, "What do you want in exchange?" He said, "The bodies." He said, "Please bury the bodies." He said, "Please tie up the corridors." He said, "Please end the festivals." He said, "Please let us file our report and leave with what dignity we have left." He said, "We are not going to remove you. We are going to record that you could not be removed." He said, "Please allow us our paperwork." I thought about it. I thought about the 84 who had died in the first night, and the 212 in the second, and the 3,000 who had died in the slow, brutal grind of the first year before we had learned the rules. I thought about Alu, who had been one of the 3,000 who had died in his sleep in the 8th month, with no warning, with no trophy any of us could identify, with nothing taken from him that we could see, and who had been the last and largest victory the shorter one had taken on the ring. I thought about Dr. Pyerly, who was still alive, still in her clinic, still running her tests. I thought about Bruto, breathing slowly on his blanket on my floor. I thought about Inez, who had died long before any of this began, of an embolism, of a thing that no one had been there to file paperwork on, of a thing that had simply happened the way things simply happen in a universe that does not care. I said, "Give me your word." He said, "We do not lie. We find lying uninteresting." I said, "Then yes." He stood up. He set the hat back on his head. He walked to the hatch. He paused there and he turned back to me, and his face did the thing it did, and for one instant I want to swear, even now, even as an old man writing this, that I saw an expression on it. I saw something. I do not know what it was. It was not friendship, and it was not respect, and it was not gratitude. It was, perhaps, the look of a clerk at the end of a very long shift who has finally been permitted to go home. He said, "Mr. Montalgo," he said, "your species is very strange." He said, "We have removed 17,000 species from this cluster." He said, "None of them have done what you have done." He said, "None of them have refused to mourn correctly." He said, "None of them have hung their corridors with the small treasures of their dead." He said, "None of them have, when offered a respectable death, declined to die." He said, "We will be telling this story for a long time in our office when the contracts are slow." Then he left. I never saw him again. We buried the bodies the next morning, all of them. We had a service in the food court that lasted the entire day. Dr. Pyerly read the names. There were 4,107 names. We took down the trophies. We stored them in a vault we built into the side of B tier. The vault is still there. I visit it sometimes. We unwelded the hatches. We turned the lights back on in the dark sectors. We ended the festivals. Although for a long time we still danced in the corridors on the anniversaries of the worst nights, because we had earned that and we were not going to stop earning it. The exterminators left. They filed their report. We were flagged. We have been flagged for 31 years now, and so far no other office has come to test the flag, although Dr. Pyerly in her last years used to say that they would eventually, the way she said most things in her last years, which was matter-of-factly and with a small steel smile. Bruto died 11 days after the taller one's last visit. He died on his blanket, with my hand on his chest. He was old, and he had been brave, and he had seen the things the rest of us had only been told about, and he had not asked for a single thing his entire life except to be near me, and I gave him that at the end, the way you give a friend the only thing they ever asked you for. I am old now. I have written this in the long evenings when the colony below has gone quiet and the habitat is mostly asleep, and my hand has shaken, and I have drunk a great deal of tea, and I have thought about what it means to have been part of what I was part of. I do not think we were brave. I have said that already. I do not think we were clever. I think we were stubborn, and small, and unwilling to follow the rules of a game whose rules were not written for us, and I think that turned out to be enough. I want to end this with a thing the taller one said to me, that I have not been able to forget, that I have turned over in my hands the way you turn over a tool you have used your whole life, and only now notice the maker's mark on. He said, when he was sitting at my knee table, before the offer, before the deal, before any of it, he said, "We have removed 17,000 species." He said it like a man reciting a number from a ledger, with no weight on it, with no pride, with no sorrow. 17,000 species. 17,000 peoples who had also lived, who had also built habitats and named their dogs and lost their wives and walked their maintenance routes. 17,000 peoples who had answered the door when the knock came, and who had been told in that patient voice that the procedures were humane by the standards of the office. We were the 17,001st. We are the only one whose name is not in their ledger as completed. I do not know if we deserve that. I do not know if any species deserves it. I know only that when the knock came, my species did not answer it the way the form required, and that turned out to matter. I know that my friend Alu Akinwen put his big tired hands around a mug of tea on a morning 40 years ago and said, "Well, Victor, if they want to play a game, we should figure out the rules, and the rules we figured out were not their rules, and the game we played was not their game." I think about Alu most nights. I think about him standing in my hatch with the spirit in his glass, listening, not calling me crazy. I think about Dr. Pyerly at the clinic, with her bun the color of old steel, taking blood from the dead. I think about the Henderson boy who never spoke again, and who lived to be 41, and who painted, in his quiet way, hundreds of pictures of two figures in long coats and wide hats, and who died of nothing in particular, of just being tired in his sleep on a Tuesday, the way some people do. I think about Bruto. I think about Inez. I think about the small things we hung on the railings, the buttons, the photographs, the milk teeth. I think about how, in the end, it was not the weapons we did not have, and not the bigger guns we never got that saved us. It was the small things, the small refusals, the small treasures of the dead, the willingness when offered a clean and respectable extinction to make a mess of it instead. I am going to put down the pen now. My hand is tired and there is tea in the kitchen, and the recycler hums at a frequency I stopped hearing 40 years ago. If you are reading this, you are alive. If you are alive, you are flagged. The flag will not hold forever. Nothing holds forever. When the next knock comes, and it will come, I want you to remember what an old maintenance hand from B-tier learned in the dark years on Halcyon Ring. I want you to remember that the procedures are humane only by the standards of the office that employed them, and that the office is not your office, and the standards are not your standards, and that the form has a line on it for exceptions, and that the exception is you. Do not answer the door the way they expect. Do not mourn the way they require. Hang the small things on the railing, sing in the corridors, refuse the schedule, be stubborn, be small, be too much trouble to remove. And when the clerk at the table picks up his hat and tells you that your species is very strange, and that they will be telling stories about you in the office when the contracts are slow, you will know, the way I knew, that you have done the work. That is all I have to tell you. That is the whole of it. Inez, Bruto, Alu, Eva. The ring is quiet tonight. I am going to drink my tea.